Sorry, the video turned off for some reason. Um, but anyways, back to where we were. So there was still this idea at the time that um, the British couldn't lose. Was the idea like maybe a lot of people at the time thought maybe you know the Americans can, or the colonies rather, um, maybe they can make it interesting for a while. Maybe they can really annoy the British. Maybe they can last it long enough. Especially if they get the French involved in it, maybe they can like drag it out long enough to where it won't even be worth it for the British. But you know, if the British want to win, they will win. So now the British come and take New York. That's their way of saying, we want to win. We're not going to let you guys win. Let's just go ahead and negotiate a peace. And the Second Continental Congress was intrigued enough that they sent John Adams to lead a delegation um, to meet with the British to talk about it. And they were thinking maybe this is about, some sort of compromise. We get our independence, but they keep some of the whatever. Who knows? But the British were just unequivocally, you need to take back the Declaration of Independence. And the colonies weren't going to do that. And so, nothing came of it. From there, though, um, the British went from Brooklyn. They took the rest of New York City, almost captured George Washington, and, he got lucky, got away. Um, then from there, as you can see on the next part of your notes, so the British are in New York, then they, move and take New Jersey from there. So they're kind of, New York is their base, and they're starting to expand out of New York. And so now they have a group in Canada, in Nova Scotia, Canada, a group in, by group I mean army, an army in New York. And now they're starting to expand from New York into New Jersey. Um, so they take New Jersey, and the Continental Army, led by Washington, was in New York, retreated to New Jersey. Now they've retreated back to Pennsylvania. Um, which at that time, you have to think of it in these terms. The ratio of patriots, if you want to call them that, to loyalists, maybe 60 to 40. This wasn't, we tend to think back, on those times as if there was a collective patriotic fervor that was the reason why they were able to push through the hard times. It's not really what it was. You had a group of intellectuals that believed in no taxation without representation. Then you had a group of, crazy rabble rousers like Ethan Allen and Sons of Liberty and, Sam Adams, stuff like that. Then you had a group who generally wanted to self-govern. And they made up probably about 60%. Then you had 40% who were like, what are we even doing here? The British, come on. The British are fine. We're loyal to the British. We're the patriots because we're sticking with it. So when the British just came and just took New York, and then came and just took New Jersey and beat both George Washington both times, already there's a danger there. Morale is flagging. People are wondering why we're even doing this. We can't win a single battle. The leader of our army, George Washington, can't win a single battle. There was no one had been, it's been 6, 9 months, maybe a year now, and nobody's getting paid. None of the soldiers are getting paid. What are we even doing here? There's a danger here, which made the fact that Washington crossed the Delaware River, which is a famous work of art, back into New Jersey, beat the British armies at Trenton and Princeton, and regain New Jersey. That was huge. It didn't last very long, but that was huge. It was, oh, wait a minute, we won a battle, we can win. Old George, our boy, that was a big deal, because it helped inspire the troops. It helped morale. It meant that the British just couldn't come walk all over us and take whatever they wanted. It was a big deal. Um, in 1776, but it was a big deal, but it didn't last very long. And in 1777, which is when the British really should have won, they came to the conclusion that New England was where all of the problems were. It was the intellectual hub of the Revolution. Everyone was following New England, and so if they could take New England, nobody in the South would keep the war going. It'd be over. They would win. And they were right. If they had taken New England, they would have won right then and there. And they should have. Somewhere along the line, there was a huge miscommunication. Because inexplicably, while a huge army came to Saratoga, from Canada. So they come from Canada to Saratoga, and the effort to cut off New England, the army from New York, which was supposed to reinforce them, and then they would move up and they would cut off New England, the army from New York went to Pennsylvania and took Pennsylvania, which is fine. That's great. I mean, that was our capital at the time. The Second Continental Congress had to leave. I mean, that's all well and good. Capturing Philadelphia is a noble goal and a key goal. But the whole point was we were taking New England. And that was the goal, to end the war. How was there a miscommunication between two huge armies when the whole point was we're going to end the war right now, and the way we're going to end the war is we're going to take New England? Is everybody in agreement? Yeah, let's take New England, let's take New England, let's take New England. And then New York goes to Philadelphia and captures it. King George must have been thinking, okay, great, but what the heck? Especially because, as you'll see in the notes, the Battle of Saratoga, if anyone were to ask you if there's only one reason why the Americans won the Revolutionary War and won their independence, what would it be? My answer would be Benedict Arnold. The biggest reason that the Americans won the Revolutionary War. Because if the Americans don't win the Battle of Saratoga and capture the British Army there, then they don't win the war. They lose. In 1777, they lose. Because of the taking of Philadelphia, if Saratoga wins there, moves and takes New England, the war's over. So we don't win the war unless we win the Battle of Saratoga, and we don't win the Battle of Saratoga without Benedict Arnold. Horatio Gates, who was technically the commander of the army for the Americans, was an absolute joke. Benedict Arnold came, and historians agree he won that battle for the Americans. And that's why, and for that reason, and because of, and the other reason why it was so important is not only did it prevent them from taking New England, but without the Battle of Saratoga was the reason why the French joined the war. The French don't join the war, we probably don't win. So two reasons. First, we prevented them from taking New England, which would have caused the British to win the war right then and there. Secondly, winning the Battle of Saratoga was the event that caused the French to join the war. And if the French don't join the war, we probably lose the war a little bit later. So the Battle of Saratoga was absolutely huge, pivotal moment. The irony is, and this is a side note that you don't need to know for the test, this is just because I love Benedict Arnold. The irony is that it was a direct result of the way that the Continental Congress responded to the Battle of Saratoga that Benedict Arnold would end up get better, and become a traitor and try to turn the war back towards the British years and years later. which is just this irony that he was the biggest reason why we won the war. Continental Congress basically screwed him over. And so then he turns into, I mean, the man just wanted to be a hero, which is both admirable and a shame, because it would eventually lead to him becoming a traitor, which is too bad. Um, so then the next thing you see there, and this is just kind of like a little bit of an interruption before we move on in the timeline of the war, but like I said, the Battle of Saratoga is what caused the French to join the war, and which made France the first nation to recognize the Declaration of Independence. Once France recognized it, then relatively quickly Spain and the Dutch both recognized as well. And this was hugely, hugely important because the French would play into Yorktown, and that was the biggest deal. But even more than that, France, Dutch, and the Spanish did two things. First, they started a Atlantic blockade, so a blockade in the Atlantic Ocean, which hindered the British, and it caused. Now the colonies were just one theater in a war, and so the British had to divert resources to two different areas. One, the Atlantic blockade, and then two, the colonies in the Caribbean, which the Spanish saw what was going on in America, in North America, to be an opportunity for them to regain some of the Caribbean colonies that the British had over the past 100 or 200 years kind of solidified. And like I said, the Caribbean colonies, because of the sugar that they produced, were infinitely more important than the American colonies. British people liked tobacco and they liked cotton, but they needed sugar. So the Caribbeans were a lot more important. So they had to divert troops there, so that it meant that the British couldn't focus solely on the American colonies, which was a huge deal. So one of the questions on the midterm is probably going to be something to the degree of, there's going to be one probably about what caused the American Revolutionary War to happen. What were the events that caused it to come about? And then there's probably going to be a question related to what caused the Americans to then win the revolution. Make sure in that question that one of the answers is the Battle of Saratoga and the alliances that it developed with the French and the Spanish and the Dutch, and what that meant, as far as the British having to divert their resources to other areas of the world. So moving on with the timeline now. So after 1777, when Benedict Arnold captured the British Army, the northern theater of the Revolutionary War was at a little bit of a stalemate. The British had taken Philadelphia, and they had New York. Washington was kind of Washington and his army were kind of licking their wounds in the Delaware, Northern Virginia, New Jersey, that kind of area. They were in no position to fight yet, because they were fighting the quick battles in succession of the Battle of Brooklyn, and then being forced out of New Jersey, and then kind of retaking New Jersey and the crossing of the Delaware. That had decimated Washington's army, and so they were in no position to do anything. And so there was just kind of this stalemate where the British were kind of trying to decide, okay, what should we do? We have Philadelphia, we have New York, that's awesome. We tried to take New England, our army got captured, which means we're in no position to even take, it's not even like the Americans beat the army back, they captured that army, so that army is done. So we can't take New England right now without way more troops from the British. And of course at that time, if you were to say, hey, we need more troops, it's going to be 6 months before the letter has to go all the way back to Europe, and then the troops have to come all the way. I mean, it's going to take months and months and months and months and months for more British troops to get there. And so the British can't take New England until they get more troops. but Washington's in no position to take back either Philadelphia or New York. And so in the Northern Theater, there's kind of this stalemate. So what became important over the next couple of years is that the British sort of changed their strategy. Instead of, I mentioned before that their strategy to end the war was we're going to take New England because that's kind of like the proverbial head on the snake. If we take New England, we cut that head off of the snake, the body dies, right? That was kind of their strategy. Well, they decided to change strategies, and they said, hey, if we start taking the South is where there's a lot more people who are loyal to the British in the South than there are in the Northeast. And so if we start taking the South, people are going to rally to our cause. There was a lot of immigrants in the South who didn't yet have an identity as Americans, and so they were loyal to the British. There's a lot more slaves in the South who would join the British if it meant they could have their freedom, which it would. And then there's a lot just more loyalists in the South. And so the idea was if we start taking the South, their will is going to leave, and a lot of, the South is going to solidify behind us. And then we can kind of come up and just, from New York and Philadelphia, and then our army coming up the South, we'll just sandwich in the Continental Army in Washington. So that was the idea, and at first it started working great. They took Savannah, which means they controlled most of Georgia. Then they went up and they took Charleston, and then one other battle, but mostly the Battle of Charleston. And so now they had South Carolina and Georgia. And you've got to imagine at this time things are looking pretty desperate because they have New York, they have Philadelphia, and now they're just kind of moving up the South, and they have our two lowest colonies. And so the thought is, well, what's going to happen? Well, what happened was, for whatever reason, the British miscalculated how the loyalists, for one thing, they miscalculated how many loyalists they were. They saw it as more of a 50-50 split, and it wasn't quite. And also, they miscalculated how loyal the loyalists were. In other words, they thought that the loyalists hated the Patriots and couldn't wait to fight for the British and loved the British, which wasn't true. The predominant majority of loyalists simply did not see a philosophical reason or a political reason to break away from the British. And because they didn't see that, they certainly weren't going to fight for that. They didn't really care. They didn't see the British as like these horrible, horrible people, because in their minds, we've been here for 30 years and we've barely heard anything from the British. Yeah, they're taxing us a little bit. Well, what do we care? I'm not going to fight for that. But they also didn't love the British. They certainly weren't going to fight for the British either. The whole point was they didn't want to fight. And so the British miscalculated that. And so not a lot of loyalists rallied to their cause as much as they thought. Which means that as they moved north from Savannah to Charleston, and then they started to move into North Carolina, the lands that they left behind, everything went crazy. And it sort of dissolved into militia, guerrilla warfare. And I don't know if you've seen the movie The Patriot. Not a historical movie at all, but it did do a good job of showing kind of what things like that were happening, and that Cornwallis is moving north, and what he's leaving behind is being devastated, and it's not being solidified. And so the British are having to expend way more energy than they thought they were going to have to hold Georgia, to hold South Carolina. And eventually they won it. Eventually they would move into North Carolina, and the American colonies would just regain control of Charleston and regain control of Savannah. And so it's just the British control wherever their army has to be at the time. But no one's joining their army, and so every battle means they have a smaller and smaller and smaller army. And so the Southern Theater didn't work either. Which sort of brings us to Yorktown. And Yorktown is seen as kind of the the big deal or whatever, which it was a big deal. Um, Yorktown is where the British got trapped in Yorktown, Virginia. Washington came. There was a siege. They were hanging out. They were expecting to be the British fleet to come rescue the army. The British fleet did come, but so did the French. And the French's fleet was much more impressive. And so the um, um, sorry, so the battle of the Chesapeake happens between the British and the French. The French win. Cornwallis is trapped. He has to surrender. So now, two major British armies have been captured, have surrendered. One at the Battle of Saratoga, and now at the Battle of Yorktown 3 years later. A lot of people see that as, well, that's when the colonies won, which that's just revisionist history. It's not. Um, the colonies certainly didn't think that they won. Um, the colonies were expecting the British, they're going to come back like they did before. I mean, I told you a little bit earlier that there was a time in 1776 where the colonies controlled all of the 13 states. There was no British influence anywhere. And the British simply came and took New York, and then took New Jersey, and then took Philadelphia, and then started taking the South. I mean, this was just another one of those, right? I mean, just like 5 years ago in 1776, where we controlled all the 13 states, and then the British came. Now at 1781, there's no British here right now, but obviously they're going to come back. I mean, that was the thinking at the time. And ironically, the British didn't really come back. It would be 2 years before we would sign a peace treaty. But they also didn't come. There was no really more fighting, which is hilarious. And the reason why there wasn't is because people in England they never really were like totally behind this war. They never thought it was a big deal. What did they care about the colonies? Um, King George did, but a lot of his supporters lost control of Parliament, and a lot of the people who took Parliament didn't care, which is funny, because they still had. When I said earlier that they controlled all of the 13 states, that wasn't strictly true. That the British still had New York, they just weren't doing anything. So they had 26,000 troops in the colonies. That's what some people say. Anywhere from 14,000 to 26,000. 26,000, that's a high end. But they weren't doing anything. They were just kind of sitting in New York, not doing anything. But anyways, so they still had the troops there. But what was interesting is that what the British didn't know is that the British gave up before they had to. Because there was a uprising that was taking place among the American troops at the time. And if the British had come and started fighting again, the American troops simply would have left. They would have deserted the army. They would have been gone. They would have gone west. Because even without any battles going on, and even under appearances that we have all the momentum, there's almost an uprising, and that's when one of the more famous and not famous, one of the most important and least famous events in the revolution happened, which was the Newburgh Conspiracy, which was where a lot of the officers of the Continental Army were ready to take Congress, or take the Second Continental Congress, and dispel it, and it would have been a military dictatorship, and that probably would have lasted had it happened. That's what would have ended up happening, is we would have had a military dictatorship, at least for the first however long of American history. And the ironic thing is, so the American officers are having this meeting where they're going to discuss how they're going to take the Second Continental Congress, and so that because they were really upset because they weren't getting paid. And so, how are we going to take the Second Continental Congress? We're all meeting, and they're meeting, in this tent or whatever, to have discussions about plans. What is this going to look like? Horatio Gates was probably going to lead it, And so what happened? So they're meeting, they get together, and everyone's fired up, and it's this big deal. What are our plans going to be? Let's come up with a course of action. And then Washington shows up, George Washington, and like I said before, Washington didn't really win any battles. He won one battle, two if you want to credit him with Yorktown, which you can't really. Um, but Washington was still very respected as a man. Everyone loved Washington. And so he came and he had prepared remarks. And what he said was essentially as he took out his piece of paper to read it, and he looked at it for a couple of seconds, and then he said something to the degree of, as he pulled out eyeglasses, so that he could read it, he said something to the degree of, I guess I really have given everything to my country, including my sights. I'm sorry, gentlemen, that you have to wait for me. I'm sorry to waste your time as I put on my eyeglasses, but I've given everything to my country, including my sight. And it completely took the air out of the room. So a lot of historians credit General Washington with personally ending the Newburgh Conspiracy, which, if the Newburgh Conspiracy had been successful, if they had marched on the Second Continental Congress and they had dispelled it and set up a military dictatorship, the British would have said, "Dear God, this is awesome. Let's actually go in and take this back," because they don't know what the heck they're doing. And so in that way, Washington was the main reason why we won the Revolutionary War. The irony is, it wasn't because he was a great general. It's because he was a great man, and because he dispelled the Newburgh Conspiracy. And because he dispelled the Newburgh Conspiracy, the Second Continental Congress stayed in power, and the British saw no reason to continue the war. And so, although there was no more fighting, there would be a year and a half, almost 2 years, where there was no fighting but also no peace treaty, until they signed the peace treaty in 1783, which began the Articles of Confederation were then ratified, which was what we had before the Constitution. And just very briefly about the Articles of Confederation. It did one thing good and it did one thing awful. The one thing that it did good was it convinced the states to concede Western lands to Congress, which was important. So states, because that could have been a huge disaster. States, if individual states had been fighting over which territories were theirs, that could have been an absolute disaster. And so Articles of Confederation convinced the government, under the Articles of Confederation, convinced the states to concede that those lands were held by Congress, which was a huge deal. The thing that it did very poorly is it didn't set itself up for any way to have permission to tax the states or the people. They could ask the states for money, but the states were under no obligation to get the money from their people to give to the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. Well, the problem with that is that the government had a lot of debt from creditors in Europe, and then also just to pay the troops. All this debt, no way to get the money, which then led to Shays' Rebellion, which I listed. You can go on Wikipedia and look up Shays' Rebellion. It's kind of actually a cool aspect of American history. I'm not going to get into it here because it's relatively unimportant, except to show that because there was this debt that the American government had, and because the American government had no way to collect taxes under the Articles of Confederation, people, especially people who had fought, started freaking out. And there was Shays' Rebellion, there was Whiskey's Rebellion, there was all these problems under the Articles of Confederation, which was what eventually then led to Federalists, which were led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, some of these guys. It led to them saying, we got to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, we need a real constitution. And that real constitution is what we will get into next week.